Good afternoon. My name is Jerry Firestein. I am the Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute, and we're very pleased to welcome you all here today for the launch of Jason Pack's paper, An International Financial Commission is Libya's Last Hope. Jason is, of course, a non-resident senior fellow here at MEI. Today's event is an opportunity to hear from Stephanie Williams, UN Deputy Special Representative for Political Affairs in Libya, Nate Mason, former commercial officer at the US Embassy in Tripoli, Jason himself, non-resident fellow at MEI, and the program will be moderated by our friend Jonathan Winer, formerly the US Special Envoy to Libya and also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. I look forward to hearing their insights on possible ways to move forward toward an economic-based approach to peacemaking in Libya. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to introduce the panel and proceed.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you all for being here. Thank you in particular, Stephanie Williams, for joining us from North Africa. Really grateful to have you here. When I was working on Libya full-time every day, we had three tracks that we were all constantly trying to move forward in Libya. There was the political track, there was a security track, and there was the economic track. And the economic track didn't really get going very much. It was always, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. And Jason's going to present to us some ideas on what could happen now to potentially end the various impasses that have stymied Libyan development so far. In the meantime, Stephanie is having to deal with what we called in earlier correspondence, the art of the real. What's actually happening near term right now that could affect prospects in Libya. We have the Berlin process, which has been going on for a while and perhaps will come to a culmination in an actual meeting soon. And then we have the Libyan Economic Experts Commission and a Libyan Development and Reconstruction Fund. And she's going to be talking to us about all of these developments, which will provide a framework for Jason's talk. We're then going to hear from Nate Mason on how he sees these economic realities and how they may fit against the various processes and agendas that are being framed up for us. So I think what we'll do is we'll have Jason's presentation. We'll then have Stephanie's focus on where things are right now, and we'll go from there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And that was an apt metaphor of peacemaking and all its complexities and technical details as relates to Libya. I wanted to, of course, thank Stephanie Williams for making time in her busy schedule to share with us her perspective from Tripoli, which I really do hope we will be able to have briefly. So this paper launch is the culmination of a process that began more than 16 months ago when I was invited to brief a select committee in the UK House of Commons on the state of the Libyan economy. And in preparing for that, I had a dream of writing a series of policy papers which would seek to explain to a broad audience what the crisis in Libya is really about, and then to present a plan to fix them for the good of international stability, the Libyan people, and their international allies and partners. I arrived at this goal after concluding that the established scholarly wisdom that the unique problem with Libya was its statelessness and lack of institutions was in fact a misleading formulation. To my mind, the real problem set is that Libya has many extremely deeply rooted yet dysfunctional institutions, which produce perverse incentives, which in turn gave rise to the militias, corruption, predatory business practices, the vacuum of legitimate political power, foreign intervention, and implosion of the Libyan state. So the goal of this intellectual exercise has been nothing less than to reverse the conventional wisdom, not only about Libyan statelessness and institutionality, but about how to mediate the Libyan civil war. For too long, international policymakers have thought, we can't fix the Libyan economy and its entrenched subsidy system because there's fighting going on. But I believe that logic must be turned on its head. The fighting can't be stopped while the subsidy system is going on. In this intellectual rethink endeavor, I have some fellow travelers, particularly Tim Eaton of Chatham House, whose publications deal with very similar topics, as well as Nate Mason, who'll be speaking later. The implication of all of our argument is that international attempts to mediate, which merely focus on bringing Siraj and Haftar together, for example, such as the ceasefire that was announced in Moscow today, or trying to tackle the proxy dimension of the conflict, as in theory the Berlin conference were it to happen in February or ever, that those won't hold and cannot in fact hold without some kind of meta deal about the various roles of Libya's economic institutions, the rate of the dinar, and subsidies. Because divided legitimacy and the militias are merely a symptom of these economic and structural factors, which the actual cause is the Libyan economic system. So given the above, my scholarly offerings sought to diagnose the peculiarities of the structures of Libya's semi-sovereign economic entities, which I believe we need to consider as Libya's real governance institutions. So if in the US we might be having a sovereignty crisis between the White House, Congress, and the judiciary, in Libya, sovereignty is vested in things called the central bank and the NOC, or the Housing and Infrastructure Board, and sovereignty is not vested in the HOR or the GNA, as you might think that it is. The upshot of my proposals are for international players and UNSMIL to apply maximum leverage to these semi-sovereign economic institutions to incentivize transparency, a series of audits and expert-led fact-finding commissions as an achievable first step, leading to the second step, which in theory the Berlin conference is focused on, of blocking out foreign military intervention to allow a mutually hurting stalemate to take hold. And then my third proposed step, which you have in the paper in your folders, which is for a technocratic, Libyan-led, Libyan-requested International Financial Commission to fundamentally reform and redo all the relevant institutions that I mentioned. So the meta message is, as James Carville would have it, it's about the economy, stupid. Libyans are smart, savvy, and well-informed. And when you speak to them, you always hear that the key question that interests them is not who should be the president, who should be the prime minister, but rather, how should our country's vast resources be used and distributed? What I'd like to do with the brief time that I have left, hopefully before the technical issues are resolved, is to present the main idea of each of the 4 papers in this series of publications, the last of which is the one in your folder. The first paper was entitled, not so cleverly maybe, "It's the Economy, Stupid: How Libya's Civil War is Rooted in Its Economic Structures." And that was published by the think tank IAI in Rome about 6 months ago. The paradox that this paper seeks to unravel is that the alphabet soup of Libya's economic institutions saw their degrees of sovereignty and independence, as well as their relative remove from oversight, increase over the course of the post-Qadhafi period. In other words, all of this alphabet soup of agencies, CBL, LIA, NOC, LIPTIC, HIB, ESDF, were set up in the Qadhafi period, but they weren't meant to really function independently, because if you got out of line, the brother leader somehow conveyed to you, off with your head. And if he said you've got to devalue the dinar, you devalued the dinar. The institutions had independence on paper, but were functionally subordinate to the structures of the Jamahiriya. So what's happened is that those institutions were at best semi-independent. And they towed the line out of fear of imprisonment and murder. Yes, they had billions of dollars of pots of money that they nominally controlled. But what has happened since the Qadhafi period? The political authority has been lopped off from the top, and the nominal heads of these institutions now really control the pots of money and prerogatives that they only, in theory, controlled in the Qadhafi regime. I would argue that neither the heads of the institutions nor the political class in Libya actually have the authority or the competence to police the activities of these institutions. As such, amidst the nationwide fighting that has characterized the spring and summer of 2019, Libya's semi-independent, now semi-sovereign economic institutions have a greater stranglehold over the economic life of the country than ever. And they're unable to be dissolved due to the lack of a Libyan consensus over who should replace them. In fact, the struggle over Tripoli is really a struggle over who should replace Sadiq al-Kabir as central bank governor. So due to this complex web of financial liabilities to international contractors, lack of transparency of assets, it's very difficult to dissolve these multi-billion-dollar behemoths until a complete forensic survey of the Libyan economy is conducted. Every time we get close to this, such as the UN very wisely proposing this audit, the institution heads protest, we can't act independently, we can't do the audit because we'll be attacked by the militias. Now that's a legitimate concern, and I don't want to poo-poo that. However, with the one hand saying we can't do anything until the political crisis is solved, they also block reforms on the ground that none of these governments are really legitimate to reform me. So that's paper number one. Now we're on to paper number two, published here at MEI, called How Libya's Economic Structures Enrich the Militias. And that discusses the real motherlode of militia financing, refined petrol smuggling, as well as letters of credit fraud. The political implications of these phenomenon have been explained by others, such as Wolfram Lacher, as creating a militia cartel, that the militias essentially collude with each other to all benefit from these means of illicit gain. I believe the time has come to rephrase this characterization, and we could look at all the major warlords, as well as the politicos, and all of Haftar and Siraj's advisors and hangers-on, as part and party to a status quo party, or status quo group. They all are on the take, benefiting from the handouts that proximity to these economic institutions gives you. So this second paper that I'm mentioning advocates that international policymakers can leapfrog this status quo party of entrenched politicians and warlords and militia leaders by making an alliance with the Libyan people who want to see the rear end of all of this status quo party. That brings us on to the penultimate paper, also published here with MEI, called The UN Deliberately and Albeit Mistakenly Accorded Sovereignty to Post-Qadhafi Libya's Economic Institutions. This explains what might seem to some a bizarre footnote to today's Libya problem, which is that there was this underappreciated misstep in the most important treaty concerning Libya, and that's the December 17th, 2015 Skhirat Agreement, sometimes called the Libyan Political Agreement, or LPA. That treaty accorded unfettered sovereignty to Libya's economic bodies, cementing what I would call the power grab that they achieved in the political vacuum in the wake of Qadhafi's ouster that I talked about with the first paper. Just to hit you with some textual analysis, because I think this is kind of sexy if textual analysis of the Arabic of a treaty is ever sexy. The Skhirat Agreement uses the term sovereign or sovereignty 15 times. 4 of the uses refer to Libya's national sovereignty and the need to maintain it from outside actors. And surprisingly, 11 uses of the term sovereignty refer to the sovereign nature of Libya's economic institutions and the sovereign functions of their heads. So the Arabic really clarifies this, that the head of the economic institutions are referred to using the word siyada, which means sovereign or sovereignty. And in the usages referring to those jobs are siyadiyya or wadha'if siyadiyya, sovereign positions or jobs, when referring to the heads of economic institutions. And the institutions themselves, al-muassasa siyadiyya. However, the job of prime minister, deputy prime minister, minister of planning, all of which are explained in the Skhirat Treaty, as well as presidential council member, none of those have the adjective siyadiyya or sovereign applied to them. So think about what a bizarre structure that creates, whereby the head of the audit bureau or the head of the Housing and Infrastructure Board is sovereign, but because this is a transitional government and it was never approved by the HOR, blah, 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 the prime minister himself is not sovereign. So, as explained, these institutions lacked independence under Qadhafi, but in the post-Qadhafi period, they've used the political vacuum to develop greater independence. I would say that what they've achieved is semi-sovereignty, Yet the drafters of this Skhirat agreement took this a step further. They appear to have believed that they could protect Libya's wealth from disappearing into this power vacuum if only they enshrined the heads of these economic institutions would sit on the ability to create and protect and allocate billions, sovereignty. This logic might make sense, but I would say it was naive. It believed that, hey, if we give sovereignty to these economic institutions, we can protect them from the rough and tumble of the scramble for power. However, this granting of de jure sovereignty to the economic institutions gave de facto sovereignty to the militias, because the militias are the tail that wags the dog of the Libyan economic system. Because if I'm the central bank governor and I need to get to the airport, I have to pass through the airport road, which is controlled by a militia. So what do you know? I don't change the structures that pay the militia salaries or allow them to engage in letters of credit fraud. So my contention is that General Haftar, as well as his opponents, are fighting over Tripoli because it's control over Tripoli that allows you to exert power over the heads of the economic institutions. So with all that as background, we get to today's paper. The core of this paper is my attempt to prescribe a workable solution in 10 policy recommendations, while also explaining why now is actually the right time for Anglo-American leadership, what leverage the international community has and how we can deploy it, and what we can learn from similar botched international financial mediations, such as the very famous Iraq oil for food scandal.
I think this is a perfect opportunity for Stephanie Williams to come in with the realities right now that she's seeing, the processes that UNSMIL is engaged in, and then go to your solution set for the diagnostics you've just done. So with that, if we could turn to Ms. Williams, we're grateful to have you back and interested in whatever you have to say about the economic situation, the peace talks, the future of Berlin, and to bring us closer to what's happening on the ground. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone in Washington. Good evening from Tripoli. I am coming to you from the UN headquarters compound in Oya, and we've had almost 2 days of calm since the parties to the conflict agreed to the ceasefire that was announced by the presidents of Turkey and Russia. There have been a few violations of the ceasefire that we are recording and verifying. So in terms of the population here in Tripoli, who is frankly very tired, exhausted, 150,000 people have been displaced from their homes. They're living in schools, they're living with neighbors and friends or family. We have 116,000 children who are unable to go to classes because something like 220 schools are closed, in part because there are IDPs now living in some of those schools. There are 26 health facilities which have been destroyed, and so people don't have access to healthcare, obviously, at those facilities. So for an exhausted population, the past days have given people, sort of a measure of relief. We are obviously, all eyes are on Moscow today, and we're following the progress of the negotiations that the Russians and the Turks are hosting. We understand that, according to the press conference that we saw between the two foreign ministers, it appears that the GNA has signed the agreement. Whereas Mr. Haftar has asked for, I think, the night to pause and then come back and maybe sign it tomorrow. Understand that the GNA delegation is on their way back to Tripoli. So this brings us, and as we saw in the press conference between Chancellor Merkel and President Putin, and indeed between President Putin and President Erdogan, there's reference to the Berlin process, which has been now underway since September of 2019. And indeed, there is the intention to hold the Leaders' Conference for Berlin before the end of January. In the 5 preparatory meetings that the 10 countries and the regional organizations and the UN participated in Berlin, we worked consensually on the communique for the summit, as well as the action plan, which is the UN operational document, that when you pair it with the communique, is really where the rubber hits the road. It's our work plan. And indeed, we've already started it. The communique focuses on broadly 6 areas: ceasefire, political reform. Started to build the bridge between the international and the Libyan process, because these are decisions that the Libyans are going to have to take. It's going to be a Libyan-led, facilitated by the United Nations. We focus on 3 tracks: the economic, the political, and the military. We started on the economic track last week to go in Tunis, where I led a discussion with 19 Libyan economic experts on the terms of reference for a Libyan experts economic committee, which is part and parcel of the Berlin process and supported by the countries and regional organizations that are party to that process. And what it is, proposal, we have a commission that, and it is, again, up to the Libyans to decide whether this is an advisory board or whether implementing authorities. I would caution that when you have implementing authorities, you also need to have the tools to enforce decisions, because that's, as we look over, particularly over the last 3 years, many decisions have been taken, but there's basically no mechanism, no tools for enforcement. And so, and what the experts in Tunis last week was, let's prize, the various problem sets as affects the Libyan economy, which is and has been in a significant crisis. So, we can prioritize, for instance, the banking sector. Virtually all Libyan economic experts will identify the of the central bank, the dysfunctionality between the Tripoli and the central bank in Beta is sort of the number one economic problem in Libya, and that if the banks are able to unite, will have a knock-on beneficial effect for other sectors of the economy. So, but in the meantime, we are facing an acute crisis with several several large banks in Libya, which are located in the east, and if sort of remedial measures are do have potential for basically a meltdown, collapse of some of these banks, and that would obviously add to already an acute economic and social, frankly, a social crisis if people are not able to access money. Then we can prioritize things like subsidy reform, which the government has, internationally recognized government has dragged its feet on, although it up to a series of reforms in June 2018. They've only enacted exchange rate reform. There's really not enough political will enact the subsidy reform. And it's things like, the bloated public salaries consume 60% of a public budget. And that comes at the expense of, for instance, development spending, of monies that could be injected constructively into the economy and boost investment in the private sector. Looking more long long-term discussed was decentralization, which in addition, of course, to being an economic, also a political issue. Fit in, is that something that needs to be worked in the context of a draft constitution? And again, what is the legal or legislative framework needed to enact the decentralization, which, you know, agree is one of the keys to unlocking the crisis of this focus on Tripoli. This is really the work of the mission now, is to take, I think, what is a renewed interest in the international community. And reading Jason's work, I concur with a lot of his sort of the analysis and conclusions he's drawn, that the international community needs to step up, that, you know, if we are able to reach some kind of political settlement, that this is the time for the international financial institutions and the countries that can bring the kind of expertise that the Libyans have to bear. And that's what we are doing, is we are now sort of matching that international interest with this potential for a political settlement to be ready on day one, you know, if we indeed reach the settlement. And that's why we are starting to work on the economic track. The political track is also starting to move we hope to convene a group of 40 Libyans in Geneva by the end of January, 13 of whom would be from the House of Representatives, 13 from the Higher State Council, the remaining 13 to be selected by the mission to round out the representation committees. We would also select the coordinator for this forum, which would really pick up the issues that we were at the board national conference. You know, what is the top national unity government? What's the length of the transitional period? What kinds of elections? What's the sequencing of elections? What's the constitutional frame? And this is not a decision-making body. This is a body that will kick off discussions that will, you know, taken up thereafter. The hardest track, not surprisingly, track. The GNA has put forward 3 for a 5-person on each side military commission. Haftar has not yet put names, and so we continue to urge particularly his allies to, put on him to produce those names. That's where we are. Happy to talk further.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's very helpful. It's interesting to see UNSMIL taking the lead now in the economic area. That did not happen for a long time. Both the economic and the security really were stillborn for a number of years. And to see UNSMIL able to try and take on the challenges of both of them is a very positive development. Some people have suggested that Article 64 of the Libyan political agreement has been fulfilled, which is namely that the breaches of the agreement are so profound that it needs to be fundamentally reformed, or that justifies fundamental reform. It's clear to me, as an outsider at this point, that something needs to happen to break open the status quo. And Jason was just getting to the status quo question, and I think we'll continue with his recommendations on how you break the status quo. I would like to merely observe that there are now a series of different patronage networks that have been built up under the current arrangements. There are patronage networks in the East, which have resulted in some economic vulnerabilities that are profound for the banking system in the East. There's letters of credit abuse, which have taken place in the West. There's the dependency on the Russian currency, money for nothing. Well, it's not nothing. They're all in Moscow right now. So I guess the money for nothing has resulted in something substantial over the years for the providers of those funds. So everybody's got their existing patronage networks. Well, why on God's green earth would anyone want to give up having their patronage network until the end of time? This is my inheritance. I earned it. I've got it. My savings. It should be good until I die, until my children and grandchildren die. And you have a powerful web of interests of people who want to keep the money flowing their direction, and people in various positions of power who want to keep their status. And you can't blame them under the circumstances. It's true in any situation where you have these kinds of divisions. So with those observations, I'd like to turn back to Jason. Stephanie, if you can hold on to listen more, and then make some additional comments on Jason's ideas in light of what you're seeing now in reality, and the paths that have to be taken. That would be great. That would be trenchant. I try not to use the word great anymore. And then Nate Mason, if you could come up and make comments from there, I think that would be helpful for everybody. Thank you, Jason.
Can you hear me, Stephanie? You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for your on-the-ground state of play. I thought a lot of what you're doing is inspiring, and the energy that must require for you and your team is so impressive. Tying into what Jonathan said about everyone having their own patronage networks, I think it's important to say out loud what we all know, which is that it's not just they, the bad guys, as it were, or the non-Westerners who have patronage networks. We know that Italy and France have been at each other's throats over Libya, and multinational businesses and many established groups benefit from the current state of play and need to be unpicked as part of the status quo party. So how to create people who maybe don't win as much now, but feel like they win a little, into a situation where they feel that their interests are risk, but everyone can win more. The idea that sharing the pie will help grow it. In a way, as the war has evolved, European nations have been eclipsed as the most involved international players in the Libya file. In short, too little, too late re-engagement from Europe without application of uniquely Western forms of leverage will merely showcase the extent to which non-Western countries are the ones now able to project power into Libya, as they can flout the UN arms embargoes, providing drones or mercenaries, or flouting international norms by providing direct injections of cash or illicitly printed dinars. Today's conference today's kind of ceasefires announced in Moscow visually represent that change of where the epicenter of power is. I would say, conversely, Western nations, especially if acting in concert with the Libyan people through the mechanisms and bridging mechanisms that Ms. Williams mentioned, would actually have a stranglehold of the licit economic tools that could be needed to compel both sides to work together, as well as to provide the levers and technical expertise to eliminate the economic drivers of the conflict. So the question is, why would it be worth the political capital for London and Brussels and New York and DC? My argument is that of the world's 5 major conflicts, Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, North Korea, Yemen, and Libya, Libya is the only one whose solution can pay for itself. Solving the Libya conflict would result in maybe an extra 1 million barrels a day of sweet crude, over $100 billion a year of yearly spending on mega projects, probably a few $100 billion of repayment of bad debts, which would be something that all of the involved nations who have these patronage networks could benefit from.
Bad debts can have more than one meaning in this regard.
They sure can. And you have to not forget the employment of nearly 1 million guest workers who were working in Libya just before the Qadhafi regime fell. So I think that there can be a win-win rather than the lose-lose that we're trapped in at present. This brings us to the long-awaited recommendation section. My proposed approach was formulated in concert with many of the current and former heads of Libya's most prominent semi-sovereign economic institutions, as well as recently retired senior British and American diplomats who've served in and on Libya that I've spoken to over the past few years. I found that many courageous Libyans wish to initiate reforms and wish to work together, quote unquote, across the aisle, but they lack the ability to do so and need help to face the political blowback or potential militia intimidation to get the ball rolling. my proposal, which kind of dovetails with what Stephanie has spoken about in terms of making a commission, is to establish, well, what I'm calling for is a little different than what we've heard. I would like this International Financial Commission to have its headquarters in either Malta or Tunis or London, and to have branch offices in Tripoli, Misrata, Sabha, Tobruk, Baida, Benghazi. And to achieve Libyan buy-in, the main Libyan political, economic, and institutional players have to initiate the creation of this IFC. They need to formally request it. It needs to emerge from the civil society discussions that we heard about. And then the heads of the semi-sovereign institutions need to sit on the commission and initially allow the audits of their own institutions while promoting transparency. I think the first act of the commission will be the creation of a website with easy access via social media and the internet that can communicate the actions of the IFC to Libyans and the world in Arabic and English. Libyans are really plugged in technologically. They want to know what's going on, and there's a huge reserve of goodwill to feed in. After the website is operational, the commission should be able to figure out how Libya's economy works at present. And one thing that, when I've spoken to knowledgeable players, everyone wants to know is a system to transparently monitor financial transfers in and out of the CBL and the ministries, and movements of refined petrol in and out of the country. So to achieve this buy-in from the Libyan people, rather than having the national conference, which was about a political or a constitutional solution in Libya, what if we did something like social media polling, telephone polls, to have a national economic conference, which would produce a Libyan economic agreement to replace the defunct Libyan political agreement? I think with that LEA in place, we could move to the implementation phase, undertaking subsidy reform, currency devaluation, hopefully even flotation. And finally, in fitting with this Libyan economic agreement, the laws governing Libya's semi-sovereign institutions should be rewritten by the IFC, led by the very Libyans who have convened the commission, and implemented with outside help and the relevant government authorities. So this might sound like pie in the sky, and there are many reasons that policymakers would prefer not to do the above and would prefer the photo ops of summits or potential ceasefires that can't be enforced. And I'm aware of that. And then there's another school of realists who would argue, we're 5 years into Libya's unsolvable civil war. Isn't it the time for the international community to play defense, enter containment mode, and put our energies elsewhere? I think not. Those approaches are defeatist and declinist. There's an argument that now is the right time for Anglo-American leadership, and there are actually small reasons to see that we're moving in that direction and be optimistic. The American-led economic dialogue has been gaining steam. There was a broader and more successful meeting in Tunis this December. This can be built upon and transformed. Various recent appointments within USG in 2019 and the pending bipartisan congressional legislation entitled the Libya Stabilization Act make it feasible that American political resources could be devoted to an expanded process of engagement in Libya. Once passed, this congressional legislation not only allows a broad array of sanctions against spoilers, but makes it possible to revisit the question of a presidential rather than a State Department special envoy, an appointment which could then underpin coordination of the interagency process among the departments of the Treasury, Commerce, Energy, and State. On the other side of the Atlantic, whatever you think about other implications of Boris Johnson's resounding victory on December 12th, it certainly means that Britain will very shortly have the ability to invest political capital in questions other than Brexit. And Johnson has a track record of significant interest in Libya. Remember, as foreign minister, he visited Tripoli twice, as well as Tobruk, Misrata, and Benghazi, and has frequently taken briefings on the Libya portfolio. So once led by the US and the UK, Western nations must finally use their stranglehold on international economic institutions and transactions to work with our Libyan allies while forcing spoilers either to the table or boxing them out. I think the easiest Western leverage to deploy is on Western allies like the UAE or Turkey. The Berlin conference's express purpose is to propose concrete penalties to those nations which violate the UN's arms embargo by supplying drones and mercenaries. Once the Libyan armed factions lose their most important foreign backing, it's possible that a mutually hurting stalemate would take hold, creating the ideal conditions for both sides to want to participate in the International Financial Commission process. For that to work, I think lessons must be learned from the Iraq oil for food debacle. The main one, which was told to me by retired diplomats who participated in that, is to focus on transparency while having Libyan institutions and stakeholders call for the IFC rather than having US or UN fiat decree it on them. Moreover, relative to Iraq of the 1990s, the current information technology and its broad penetration in Libya means that transparency is arguably easier now than it was at the time of oil for food. Today, it's possible to engage in diplomacy directly with the Libyan people by publishing in real time the workings of the Commission on the internet and social media, and making the reformation of the Libyan economy a collective project. In conclusion, financially and diplomatically, Libya's civil war is among the most complex and globalized of the 21st century's major conflicts. Yet, it is potentially the only one whose solution can pay for itself. My contention is that Western diplomats have heretofore been constrained in their mediation attempts, thinking about politics as the art of the possible, or potentially the domestically palatable. But Libya and the international community needs us to undertake a bold action, seeing what seemed impossible as actually possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Nate, you come on up. And Stephanie, no, I think I'd like to have you up here too, if you would. And Stephanie, if you could share thoughts as to how one gets from here to there, where the ability to initiate economic dialogue and economic decisions may be, and whether it is possible for economic talks to lead political or security rather than to follow them, in light of everything you know.
In fact, so the philosophy of Berlin and our action plan is that the steps in the economic, political, and military are being undertaken simultaneously. So economic measures can serve confidence building measures for the necessary, actions in the political military package. So tie it, for instance, to progress on a ceasefire forces, unification of security institutions. Politically, it could help the Geneva process that there's an interactive nature to this.
Stephanie?
And agree with in what becomes of the Libyan, what we're calling economic experts commission. It has to be a Libyan product. And that dialogue that we did intensively on January 6th with the participants who represented a spectrum of Libyan institutions, GNA ministries, but also stakeholders in Eastern Libya, the Eastern Central Bank, including institutions of the Eastern Libya, including rallies that reflect the views of the LNA and what we would call more sort of the Eastern Parliament voices, as well as academics and practitioners like bankers. So it was a very mostly an apolitical and very productive conversation. From that, we are pulling the information together, pulling together the recommendations to build the terms of reference. Now, ultimately, I'd be in Libyan hands and determined by Libyans as to will this be an advisory body that makes recommendations? Should it be to implement or see implementation of the policies it recommends? Or will we leave that to the state institutions and ministries? And there is, the problem is you do have these vested quo party. You know, they transitioned from the former regime post-revolution. They were embedded in the bureaucracy. They made new alliances with the revolution. So there will always be a very deep resistance to change because, after all, bellied up to the trough and are, you know, doing quite well. And this is across the country. So the mechanism for is going to be key, and that's where the international community can come in with the carrots and obstructionists, somewhat of a model of that, maybe not into successful. We tool with Libyans can be quite effective. So, I mean, that is certainly something that, in addition to holding the international community and accountable for implementation and enforcement of the arms embargo, that we see the same thing happening with the Libyan actors. This process forward. Over.
Stephanie, we were only catching about 2/3 of your words. I think that when you speak further, if you could be closer to the mic, because when you were moving away from it slightly, it was harder to hear you and it was clipping some. I think we got most of what you had to say, but I wanted you to just be aware of that phenomenon. Because we want to hear.
Okay, thank you.
We want to hear every single word you have to say, including some of the ones you're not saying. There are some of those too. Before Nate speaks, I want to make one further observation about Anglo-American whatever. As an Anglo-American diplomat, I found in the course of my work that unless we had not only the US and the UK, but France and Italy and Algeria and Egypt and the Emirates and Turkey and Qatar and China and Russia, at least, could add in Malta and Spain and Portugal and Greece and go on from there. Germany, for sure, pretty much aligned. We weren't going to make any progress in Libya because division favored people who were happy to be divided. So what I would emphasize that in connection with any new modalities, signing up broad international support and getting internationals profoundly aligned with one another, rather than having to be seen as an American or Anglo-American or any other combination initiative, is really quite essential. Nate.
All right. So I'm Nate Mason. I was the commercial attaché at the embassy in Tripoli from late 2011 to early 2013, and the economic chief for part of that time as well. So I broadly agree with what everybody's saying about the economic concerns are really the primary driver of the civil war in Libya. From my perspective, the only way things change is if there's a hurting stalemate, as has also already been said. So we'll see if that's the case. If this ceasefire may hold, it may prove to be the hurting stalemate that allows real change to happen. We don't know. My experience was really trying to work with Libyans in a relatively stable environment of the immediate post-war time, trying to work with the ministries and the semi-sovereign institutions and Libyan companies and just sort of everyone to try to get things moving. And obviously it didn't work out, right? So even with a stable country, it was difficult to get things done. So even though I agree with most of the things that people have said, I want to really emphasize that Libyans need to see something happen, right? They can't just see more commissions and more sort of groups to get together to study what the constitution looked like or how money should be divided. Things have to actually change. And a few key things that I think can change if there is really a hurting stalemate. One is the currency can be floated. We don't need to have a whole lot of conversation about that, right? If the two central banks can get together, they can agree to float the currency. They don't need to have a study. They just need to do that to end letter of credit fraud. There are various negatives associated with floating the currency, but they're pretty much all already being realized in Libya. And the letter of credit fraud is a huge problem. So they need to float the currency. Another one that's been mentioned is fuel subsidies. That's another one that they don't need to study. They don't need to have a big meeting about how you phase out the fuel subsidies or who gets what. They simply have to end the fuel subsidies because that's really billions of dollars going to organized crime, whether that's militias or criminals, or in most cases, criminal militias. This is something that it's very difficult to see how you end the war as long as the fuel subsidies remain. And it's really not, it's going to be very tempting to get into a conversation about how to do it. And Libya doesn't need a conversation about how to do it, they just need to do it. So I want to emphasize that some of this stuff just has to happen. And if it's really a hurting stalemate, it can. If people talk about maybe it'll happen in the future, then we're clearly not at a hurting stalemate, and the war is not going to end. Another is infrastructure contracts. There were somewhere between $1 and $300 billion worth of infrastructure contracts signed by the government, the Qadhafi government. A large number of those were sham contracts to begin with, but ultimately no one knew how many were sham contracts, how many were real contracts. No one knew whether any construction had happened on any particular hospital or whatever. No one went out and looked.
But that stopped after 2011. There haven't been sham contracts of that nature since then by either the governments in the East or the West, have there?
Well, there hasn't been there hasn't been $300 billion worth of sham contracts.
Are you sure?
I'm not sure, but I don't think so.
More in the high tens of billions.
Yeah. But either way, there was, in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a real effort to try to sort out these contracts because some of them were 10% finished, some of them are 90% finished, and most of them were somewhere in between. And so it was really important to figure out which ones had value and which ones didn't. By now, virtually all of those are valueless, right? If you leave a bunch of rebar sticking out of concrete in the desert for 7 years, 8 years, it's worthless. So I think the infrastructure contracts discussion has shifted from what it was. It used to be, the old contracts are really important because they have value and we need to sort them out. Now, I think we can assume that almost all of them don't have value, even if they were 90% complete. And so you can probably bifurcate the contracts into sort of dealing with the old contracts and then dealing with new contracts. Not all the companies are going to be okay with that, but enough of them will be. And I think that has actually gotten a little bit simpler to deal with than it was before, because you can just essentially write off all of the old contracts as valueless, and then it's just a matter of how much you have to pay people off for the work that they did. There is an issue where I was just reading about, some of these economic commissions and so forth. The Minister of Planning said in December, said, well, we're looking at $100 billion worth of projects, and it'll be 4,000 projects. I don't believe for a minute that the Libyan government has the capacity to manage a $100 billion, 4,000 project portfolio from Tripoli. I don't believe the US government has the capacity to manage a $100 billion, 4,000 project from Washington, right? Like, this is to me the wrong way of thinking about the infrastructure projects. The fact that we're still having conversations that seem to amount to people deciding in Tripoli where and when you're going to build an apartment building in Tobruk, this is wrong thinking. Right? This is not going to result in good things happening, which leads me to decentralization. Ultimately, in my view, when I say that economic concerns are driving the war, to me that means that there's a zero-sum conflict over Tripoli. The money all comes to Tripoli, and so everybody's fighting over Tripoli. And everyone is not just Libyans, right? Everyone's is Russians, is French, Italians, Emiratis, and
don't forget the Turks.
The Turks, everybody. There's Egyptians. There's lots of people, Sudanese, Chadians, many people fighting over Tripoli. So this really, I don't see a way to solve this conflict as long as everything is in Tripoli, right? There has to be a decentralization. It has to happen fairly rapidly so that people know that they're not in this zero-sum conflict over Tripoli. And that includes the discussion of the infrastructure projects. As long as the discussion is, well, we're going to do rental apartments in Baida and we're going to sort it out in Tripoli, it's already the wrong answer from my perspective. So I would suggest that the baseline of the conversation is to fully fund NOC, the National Oil Company operations, because that's the goose. Somewhere around 40% of money goes to the municipalities, somewhere around 40% goes direct to citizens, somewhere around 20% is a national budget. This is not going to be so simple because you have to spend more money per capita in the South because it's a vast area and they just need more infrastructure per person. So it's not super simple, but there is a simple baseline from which to start. And if people know from the outset that that's where they're going, there's less incentive to fight over Tripoli. So between just the actual planning, in that Tripoli just can't effectively plan, and anyone who was in Libya before the war, you could see that it was not effectively being governed. Centralized authority and centralized planning is not a good idea in Libya. People often tell me, well, that's the way the whole region works. I would argue the entire region doesn't work. And so, the Saudis aren't any good at it either. Neither are the Egyptians, neither are the Algerians. It's a bad model. And the fact that everybody else does it is very compelling reason not to do it in this case, because it's got a 100% failure rate over many countries. But ultimately, signaling to everybody that decentralization is going to happen, that this is going to include these infrastructure contracts. The foreigners, the Russians, the Turks, et cetera, are in part motivated by billions of dollars of infrastructure contracts, which are important to all of their economies are in trouble. And so both Libyans and foreigners ultimately need to understand that Tripoli is not the prize to contest. As long as it is the prize to contest, ceasefires are all going to be temporary.
Well, I'd like to recap that for Ms. Williams and see to what extent this mirrors any of the discussions that she's hearing from Libyans, as opposed to from all of us. End to the fuel subsidies, floating currency. That's expensive for me personally, right? I don't like that if I'm a local Libyan. So I'm going to lose from floating currency. I'm going to lose from the end of the subsidies, but some kind of cash payments, some kind of payments back to the people, and payments at the local level, and some construction projects and decentralization.
Yeah, and just real quick, I think a lot of Libyans are not actually seeing these subsidies anymore. Right? I mean, the militias have stolen the fuel and selling it at market rates. So the subsidies, it's not, I don't think actual Libyans are going to lose as much as they think they're going to lose.
So let's hear, are the Libyans talking about this stuff? Is this where they're at? Ms. Williams.
Yes, a lot of Libyans are focused on these issues, and there's a lot of consensus. Look, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here in terms of, what is the solution? What are the solutions to the economic woes, which are also the key drivers of the conflict? I agree wholeheartedly with sort of Nate's analysis and his proposed solutions in terms of removing the attractiveness of Tripoli as a target. In fact, there are a lot of very smart Libyans who recommend that even on a temporary basis to take the government out of Tripoli as you're in this process of disarming the militias and sort of, rebuilding the state and sovereign institutions of the capital, that you take the government out of Tripoli and you put it somewhere like Sirte or Jafra, where people can make decisions without being under the threat of arms. With regard to the development projects or reconstruction, that is also a piece of the economic basket in Berlin that I should have mentioned earlier, which is that we proposed a Libyan Development and Reconstruction Fund, and that in fact, because of this tendency for decisions to be taken centrally from Tripoli, who don't know what people in Ghazi or Sabha need, that the reconstruction fund in particular focus not on how we have destruction in Tripoli, so there are areas that are going to need some assistance and but also obviously Benghazi, Derna, Sabha, Marzouk. So this is actually written in the Berlin communique to make it clear to that across the country. And, you know, the South has been traditionally terribly neglected, and this is where we get back to the importance of decentralization and somehow making that happen. The suggestion, for instance, is that you write a new chapter into the budget, like a chapter or where you are explicitly funding the municipalities, and it's not having to come through this over-centralized and quite corrupt, Ministry of Local Governance, which is, feasted upon by the different armed groups. So, yes, I'm all sort of part and parcel of what we're hashing out with the Libyan experts themselves. I expect to take the conversation forward. Will continue to feature prominently.
Thank you. I like Jason to respond, and then I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. I don't know if we have a mic here, a separate mic for the audience questions. So I think anybody, Nate, if you could grab that microphone to your left.
So while we're
and then I'm going to just recognize people, and they should go right at any of us.
While we're prepping for audience questions, just to respond to a few issues that came up, I think all four of us are singing from the same hymn sheet, on slightly different octaves. I think a key point that Nate mentioned that I left out of my remarks, but is in the paper, is this issue of decentralization. I couldn't agree more, and it's something that I've been writing about and talking about since 2012, about the need to have money go directly to the municipalities in a transparent way that can be monitored online, and then see how that the municipalities have spent that money. And in a way, I think I might have initially gotten this idea from you all those years ago. So that's a crucial point. I would nuance the idea that this model of central planning for mega projects has been, quote unquote, tried in Saudi and Algeria and Kuwait and failed there. I think that Libya is a little bit different. Libya is only similar to Yemen within the larger Middle East in terms of the dominance of the periphery from a social and tribal perspective. And Libya is the only oil economy which has this bizarre centralized institutions, but socially the power resides not in the center. That doesn't work, and it really requires decentralization, maybe more than the social structures of, say, Saudi or Kuwait or Qatar. Then on the question of low-hanging fruit, yeah, there actually is quite a consensus, more now than 3 or 4 years ago, about things like devaluing the dinars and subsidies reform. But it's a question of getting the political will. It's really tough, even if it isn't going to hurt that many people humanitarianly. No one wants to be blamed. They've seen what happens in South America when you cut the bread subsidy. So the last thing that a Libyan political wants is to be responsible for it on his plate. And I didn't get to articulate this, but part of the reason for there being a commission is then no one Libyan official is blamed when, for example, the subsidies are cut. So the need for this commission, although collectively Libyan stakeholders convene it, no one can be blamed. We're going to kill you when you go to the airport because you cut the fill-in-the-blank petrol subsidy. This blocking function, I think, is quite important. And there's collective legitimacy because sticking your head out in a militia-dominated situation is difficult, but yeah. And then to circle back to Jonathan's point, yeah, I was not clear in my formulation. The role that I envision for both Western countries and Britain and America is not so much as dominating, but maybe convening, because nothing can happen if all the stakeholders aren't on the same page. But there is a way in which certainly the last 3 years of Franco-Italian tensions and Russian and Turkish mercenaries or troops being on the ground discredits them from being neutral. And this convening role can be more palatable in a Libyan context, I would argue, from some kind of Anglo-American convening power with the Germans and other Northern Europeans as quote unquote less biased. And I was very happy to hear Stephanie mention the idea of the government potentially going to Hoon or Sabha or Sirte. I know that Ahmed Jahani and Hamam al-Fezi and those who have been talking about this for many years will be very happy. And yeah, would love to hear from the audience and their ideas and questions about how we can get people interested in trying to help Libya.
I personally have always wanted the Deus ex machina in Libya to be the IMF and the World Bank, but for some reason they're not choosing to play God right now either. It seems to me that the question of who the Libyans want to act as the convener is going to matter a great deal, and who the Libyans are willing to be convened by, if anyone. With that, I'd like very much to turn to our guests for the audience questions. Bill Lawrence. And identify yourself when you speak, please.
Bill Lawrence, University President. I was only here for the last 25 minutes, so I'll assume that
Just closer to your, just closer in.
I'll assume that since I came late, if I'm addressing something that was already addressed, then but what I was thinking through 25 minutes that I heard, and knowing two or three of you, is that, and getting back to Jonathan's very important question from that, is how do you run all of this through the Dirk Van der Wal description of the Libyan economy? I mean, there are many things in the distributed state model that militate against the excellence of those things that we're doing. So, given that the periphery often loses in Libya, given that Tripoli still is there, given that flawed on both sides of the conflict are not fighting for the Libyan reality you're describing, but even though they'd like the spoils to be what you're describing, and I'm not disagreeing with any of that. The recommendations you're making, it's more how do you build consensus among young Libyans who will ultimately determine whether they buy into this or not, that these things will work for them. And by way of throwing out a way, sometimes you can do demonstration projects. Sometimes through decentralization, you can say, okay, we're going to do this in one town and you can all see how it succeeds. That would be one way, but there may be other ways that you could build consensus among young Libyans to buy into this reform program that you guys are suggesting.
My thought on that point for a long time has been, let's start with the carrots rather than the sticks. And what are the two carrots? Carrot one is, we're going to put money in your pocket. Yeah, you'll lose some of the subsidies, but the money's going to your pocket. You'll get to decide how to spend it. That's carrot one. Carrot two is money that's going to go to municipal councils where you live in your city, and they'll decide how to spend it. And if your garbage doesn't get picked up, or people don't get to go to decent schools, you can talk to your locals because they're the ones who are going to have the money. It's X amount per capita. And so if you provide those two carrots, it may be easier to get a discussion going where you can accept the notion of the subsidies being gone and the floating currency. Not guaranteed income, cash payments to everybody by virtue of being a Libyan. Whose oil is it? It's Libyans' oil, not Libya's oil. It's Libyans' oil. It's for them. Nobody else has a right to that money. You do. And so if you start with that principle, and I don't know to what extent, again, UNSMIL is hearing Libyans talk about these concepts. I'm very interested in whatever Stephanie's thoughts are. I've always wondered, though, if by providing those kinds of carrots or incentives front end, you might then be able to get the back.
So this is the Abdurrahman al-Aghaili, Hamam al-Fezi, Ahmed Jahani Libyan economic agreement idea. I know that Stephanie hears it from them, and she and I have spoken about it. So yeah, completely agree. I think to some extent your question was dealt with in my remarks when you were not here. To recapitulate that, I am trying from a kind of academic perspective to reframe Dirk and George Joffe and Lisa Anderson's debate. I no longer believe that Libya was stateless. Yes, when I started my PhD and published about it, I read all those books and I bought into that. But that is misleading because the thought there was Tunisia and Egypt have institutions, be they the army or civil society, or, as you know better than anyone else in this room, the Tunisian Trade Union, the UGTT, and those institutions could fill the transition, or in the Egyptian case, block the transition. But Libya was a tabula rasa, and therefore, it would be written how it was written in the wake of Qadhafi's ouster. I think that was wrong. Libya has these almost immovable things called the Housing and Infrastructure Board, the ESDF, all the liabilities for the contracts that Nate has meant. And what has befallen Libyans is the implications of their not having had a complete revolution. They had an uprising, I would say uprisings. The uprisings didn't sweep away the old institutions. So we're left with institutions for which there is no political logic. I think hearing it echoed among the four of us, but also among the Libyans that we speak to, there really is a large consensus about decentralization, money to the communities, dealing with subsidies in the dinar rate. And in a way, that has to deal with acknowledging that the Dirk van der Wal idea of Libya is another kind of rentier state, that it's a stateless rentier state, is not really where the academic consensus should be.
And on buy-in,
We spoke about that a lot.
Ms. Williams?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last from the audience.
Next one.
Oh, well, I've got a quick comment, which is just that this is not all going to continue just as it is, right? With the Libyans, they don't make a deal. They don't just get to sit there and continue not making a deal. Like increasingly, it's not up to Libyans. Increasingly, we're seeing that foreign powers are deciding. And clearly, Egypt has long maintained that Eastern Libya is its area of influence. I'm one of the few people in Washington, it seems, but I believe that Algeria is serious in its recent announcement, essentially that Western Libya is its sphere of influence. So the foreigners will divide the country. If the Libyans don't make up their minds, they won't just continue to not make up their minds. The foreigners will make up their minds.
Next question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder if the topic is correct. Is an international financial commission Libya's last hope? So my question is, the financial institution is the biggest problem in the outside world than Libya. So what do you think financial institution commission would help Libya to do anything except more trouble?
May I?
Sure.
My belief is that many other approaches have been tried. Stakeholder-centric approaches, elected official-centric approaches. Now is the time for this financially centric approach because that's the causative aspect of the problem in Libya. That's what I was trying to explain. People have frequently said, no, the militias are the real problem. Everything else is a symptom. Or the jihadis are the real problem. Everything else is a symptom. I'd like to reverse that logic and say, no, it's these economic incentives that you can print free money by having access to letters of credit or getting multiple salaries from the Libyan government or the dinar rate. That is the cause. The militias and the jihadis and state implosion are the symptoms. So what I'm saying, kind of playfully, is a financial commission Libya's last hope. It's because we're 9 years since the collapse of the Qadhafi regime and 5 years into the Libyan civil war. There's been a lot of mediation going on, and it was encouraging to hear that, yes, the other approaches are now finally having an economic dimension to have financial institutions. And I'm not speaking here about the IMF or SWIFT codes, and those things are important, but the Libyan financial institutions. the CBL, the NOC, as I mentioned, the Housing Infrastructure Board, ESDF, LIPTEC, GCAL. I mean, we haven't even mentioned GCAL. I'll toss out an interesting statistic here. Libya has the most inefficient electricity sector on earth. It costs about 33 cents to produce a kilowatt hour in Libya, but that's billed at less than 0.5 cent to the Libyan consumer, but less than 1 in 1,000 Libyan consumers actually pay that. So this means that GCAL collects less than 1/10,000th of the money spent on generating electricity for the Libyan people. Therefore, it shall not surprise you that Libya has about half the population of Tunisia, but consumes much more than twice the electricity because the incentives are so wrong. So the reason why this is a financial problem is so long as you have these institutions, such as GCAL being literally just an obvious example, you're going to continue to have brokenness and the ability to arbitrage and steal things like electricity and refined petrol because it's all part of the mafia who can benefit from these incorrect economic structures.
We've got a question over here.
Hi, my name is Shadho. I'm a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute. My question is, what makes you think that the spoiler effects that we've seen in various ways in basically all processes till now, each mediation, be it through the UN or other channels, has seen some kind of spoiling from Libyan actors as well as foreign actors. What makes you think that the financial track that you try to design could be shielded from this spoiler effect?
I'd like to address that briefly. I don't think it can be shielded. In my experience, however, when you have a really significant crisis, people who are really, really desperate start considering things they wouldn't accept under any other circumstance. So it might be that in the East, they have a crisis in getting a hold of hard currency, that the banks are so weakened, they've been so decapitalized that there's no additional lending. They've got all these contracts that are out that have been issued with people with, they've got paper obligations too. And other than the Russian banknotes, which provide you access to dinars, but not dollars, at least directly, there may not be a ready source of liquidity or of underlying funds. So if that problem gets severe enough, maybe, it begins to drive reform. Similarly, in the West, if political support starts disappearing because of perceptions that there's too much corruption, and that the ability of the government to go on because the perceptions about corruption becomes contested, and that the central bank government may no longer be able to stay in place merely by staying in place and feeding the things he's been feeding. You may begin to have some conditions where people will give way, particularly if you have demand. Why aren't I getting my money? You guys are getting rich. Me and my family, we're not rich. We're barely making it. So if you begin to get people who feel that they're not getting their fair share, and other people whose political strength and economic strength is being undermined by reality, is not sustainable, maybe you begin to create conditions in which an economic track can move ahead, because the political and economic and social incentives have changed. That's been my thinking, my hope on the issue. I'd be grateful if we could have further thoughts from us now.
So I would just touch on a couple of points that have come up in the discussion, the two questions that I've heard. What makes this particular process that we're involved in with Berlin, with the upcoming meeting, and the focus on the economy? And I have to say, I joined UNSMIL in July 2018. We started the economic policy unit in the mission in September. At the time, I had member states who were sort of saying, what are you doing? Why don't you just focus on the, political process, government, elections, constitution? Just stay away from this economic stuff. Guys, you don't know what you're doing. We have seen an entire transformation
sometimes no disagree.
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Stephanie.
Yeah. This is what happens when you don't pay for the name brand easy button.
While that's being sorted, I really like Jonathan's answer of the mutually hurting stalemate. That's how I would translate that, that if there is this mutually hurting stalemate, well, he and I have been ping-ponging this back and forth for a while. And it may be that conditions are different given the foreign penetration of this current round of civil war, a greater degree of foreign penetration than previously. But to your question, you're right that if the incumbents, i.e. the militia leaders who benefit from the current system, are going to suffer too much, they could just upend the process as spoilers. And I think, therefore, a mutually hurting stalemate where they can't win. Do you know what I mean? There really is a bizarre psychology that despite the fact that it's taken Haftar 9 months and they've, any territorial gain they essentially made in the first week, he still believes, I'm going to win this war because there's going to be new Russian mercenaries or I'm going to get more arms. And on the other side, when you talk to GNA folk, they're like, well, it's true. We haven't been able to counterattack other than in Gharian in June, but we're going to win. Don't worry, we're going to win. If that goes away and the idea of conquering the whole country or winning goes away, then you've got to compromise. And the main factions, to my mind, and this is a quote unquote advantage of Libya not being a sectarian issue, is that it's a 90+% Sunni Arab country. And even the Berber or Ibadi Kharijite, which you have a very small amount in Jebel Nafusa and Tebu and Tuareg in the south, there hasn't been a history of civil wars or hatred like look at Lebanon and Iraq and Syria, where back in the Ottoman Empire, there were massacres, one group killing another. We don't have this in Libya. So that encourages me that people are fighting over money and power and not fighting because, you know what, your great-grandfather killed my great-grandfather's tribe. In fact, in Libya, it wasn't like that. And this shows that in Libyan battles, they tend to fire into the air and run away, unlike in Syrian and Iraqi and Lebanese battles where they cluster bomb each other's villages. And that's why I think there is an ability to make progress on that.
That's a happy note. I want to give Nate an opportunity for one more intervention. I'm going to let the audience go. You've been very patient. We've gotten to our allotted time.
It's like you assume I'm not going to give a happy note.
Well, you can do whatever note seems right
I
to
actually
you.
tried to be very positive there.
Yeah. I don't assume at all that there is a hurting stalemate. I hope that there's a hurting stalemate, and so that people change their behavior on that basis. As I just mentioned, if they don't change their behavior, eventually foreigners will decide what happens in Libya. But I think we have to recognize that it's not like there are these two, it's not like the North and South in the United States or something. It's not like there's these two highly organized groups that are fighting for something. There are these loosely organized constellations of militias. And Haftar's militia is essentially based on Haftar advancing. If Haftar doesn't advance, what's the point of Haftar, right? Like if he's sort of stuck in a stalemate, all of a sudden to survive, he has to change the game, right? He has to say, instead of advancing, he has to do something. He can't just sit there. Losing or not winning, I don't think leads to him keeping power, even if it was just in the East. And the coalition in the West, they're held together by the threat of Haftar. So if there's a stalemate that's going to be enforced by outside powers, what's keeping them together? So there's incentives for the leadership of these constellations of militias to change the game and do something different. Whether they will, I don't know. I mean, I think it's entirely possible that foreigners decide what happens in Libya in the future.
Clearly, there are going to have to be solutions among foreigners, alignment among foreigners, alignment among Libyans. I hope there have been sufficient incentives for the audience to stay here to the end. We're grateful to you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks for moderating.